The Hatter leaned forward, placing his hands on the Bellerophon's wheel. "Such a duty for only the noblest of noblemen," he mused. "Flying face first into a Bavarian blockade. Very noble indeed." One or two of the crewmen began whispering to one another. They hadn't been told anything about a blockade. It was their understanding that their target was a Bavarian naval base at The Hague. They ceased their whispering, however, at the sound of Admiral Roquefort's eye turning in their direction. Commander Fielding eyed the Admiral closely. Like his crew, he had not heard tell of any blockade. "I wouldn't expect a libertine like you to comprehend our charge," lectured the Admiral. "It was your kind that wore colors when Prince Albert was murdered." Commander Fielding watched the Admiral's face, for he knew what von Arkham's response would be. "Now hold your horsepower, sir," began the Mad Hatter. "Murder? Did not a Bavarian vessel also go down that day? It was my understanding that it was still as of yet heretofore unknown as to whose warship fired first." Roquefort scoffed at the Mad Hatter's words, almost in expectation. "Just the sort of thing I would expect to hear of a Bavarian sympathizer." "Sympathizer?" von Arkham exclaimed, as if he was offended. "By no means, sir. I find Eisenfaust to be just as much of an insolent, snivelling brat as Vicky." There was an audible intake of breath throughout the bridge at the captain's remark. "Treason!" exploded the Admiral, brandishing his saber. "I'll have your head for that!" Commander Fielding knew that taking a sword to the Mad Hatter would not end well. Raising his voice to match the Admiral's, he demanded, "What do you mean by impeding our operations?" Both the Hatter and the Admiral turned to face the commander. The Admiral held his blade still, and the Hatter widened his grin. "I mean, dear Algernon, to do you a favor." "A favor!" spat Admiral Roquefort. "By what arrogance do you assume to aid us in our duty to Queen and country by halting our passage?" The Mad Hatter narrowed his grin and lowered his voice. "Queen and country. It does rather boggle me that you all still consider these two things to be synonymous. What's good for the goose is good for the goslings, and all that, I suppose. But I just can't seem to get my head around it. How can flying face first into a Bavarian blockade, hopelessly and allegedly unknowingly outnumbered, benefit either Queen or country?" The Admiral was about to speak, but the Hatter continued. "I suppose that luring Bavaria's forces westward would leave them spread thin enough for an invasion on their eastern border. But from what I can foresee, such a course of action would also lead to an almost total decimation of Britain's northern fleet, a Bavarian advance on Scotland, an exorbitant increase in taxation on the British public for the purpose of rebolstering the war effort, not to mention a dreadful black stain on Algernon's military record, and a shameful fall from grace in the eyes of the British public." Von Arkham was only looking at the commander now. "And what a pity that would be, after showing such heroism at the Thames estuary." Fielding's nerves tensed at the mention of the Thames estuary. He was relying on the hope that von Arkham would not divulge too much about the Vanguard, but he let the Hatter continue. "For what a tragedy would it have been had Algernon Fielding not been there to show such bravery that day! That dreadnought ship would have completely demolished the Canary Wharf airship port and the Greater London Telecom Tower. How awful would that have been? Why, public transport and communication in and out of London would have been practically crippled. Can you imagine the consequences? Holiday trips would be postponed, The mail would be late, emigration would halt. Think of all the public institutions that would suffer. The post, the news, the radio broadcast, the public forum, the anti-war protesters, the scientific resistance. Gadzooks! It could have even halted certain illicit declassified information from spreading throughout the empire. A more inconvenient contingency couldn't have been planned. The Hatter paused, lifting his eyebrows and turning his head to glare at the Grand Admiral. Could it? The Admiral did not respond, but stood seething at the Hatter's words. Fielding found it odd that the Admiral did not dispute von Arkham's near accusation, but did not speak as von Arkham turned his gaze back to him. How fortunate that Algy was there to avert such a catastrophe! And how equally catastrophic would it be for such a brave man to lose his honor over such a fruitless assault? For Queen and country, indeed. In fact, I can only see the outcome of this battle benefiting one of those two things. And I'll give you a hint. It's the one that looks like an old bulldog that's eaten 3 times its weight in meat pies. The Grand Admiral would not stay silent any longer. "I'll not tolerate such treasonous audacity!" he burst. "This vessel is under orders from Her Majesty's Ministry of War, and a villain such as you will not stand in our way." "Do you really think so?" queried the Hatter. "Because from where I'm standing, it appears that I am standing in your way. Perhaps you should have that eye of yours looked at." This was the final straw. In an instant of blind wrath, Admiral Rochfort raised his saber with poise to strike at von Arkham's throat. But the captain's topper was too quick. Faster than Rochfort could bring his sword down, the chimney on von Arkham's hat tilted forward, shooting a jet of steam into the Admiral's face. Rochfort howled in agony, letting go of his sword and falling off of his feet. The crew was about to advance on the Hatter, but halted as he caught the Admiral's saber in mid-air and brought it to the fallen man's throat. Without thinking, Commander Fielding drew his sword at the Hatter, who stood grinning over the Admiral. My! Don't you look shorter?" the Hatter taunted Rochfort, whose face was now scalded red from the steam. Fielding could not allow the Admiral to be slain, although he was almost certain that the Hatter would leave the man alive to wallow in disgrace. "Drop your weapons, sir," ordered the commander. "Certainly, Algy," replied the Hatter, letting the saber fall to the ground. "Yours is much better." Fielding's eyes left the Hatter for a moment, and fixed on the falchion in his hand. Just then, a loud metallic clank from the stern rocked the Bellerophon forward, tilting it to the bow. The crew flinched, fearing the worst, but von Arkham grinned. "Ha! It's about time!"